Hello everyone, I am Shivani Raghuveer from JAIN Online. Welcome to the webinar on Reimagining Supply Chains now and beyond the pandemic. To start with, let me ask you a small question. During the past year, while making your lunch or dinner, did you face a shortage of ingredients which forced you to change your dish? Chances are high that your answer is a yes. And it implies that you already know the importance of supply chains. Building on this background, let us contemplate what a supply chain is. A supply chain includes various tiers of suppliers. Some of them are involved in sourcing raw materials, few to manufacture components, and others to assemble the finished goods, making it a complex network. And these supply chains all across the world have been facing significant shocks during the past year. The reason? The obvious. The pandemic COVID-19 began as a health scare in China. It has manifested into a global pandemic. Now, to deal with this pandemic, government all across the world took desperate measures. Physical distancing, travel restrictions, and stay-at-home orders were a routine all around. These measures resulted in supply chain disruptions, and subsequently we faced shortages of basic grocery items and even pharmaceuticals. Not only the retail supply chains, but even the industrial supply chains have also faced unprecedented strains. An industrial supply chain is obviously more complex, with some manufacturing companies having 200 to 250 tier 1 suppliers and around 18,000 plus suppliers all across their entire supply chains. Given the complexity of industrial supply chains, even a small disruption can put 3 to 5% of EBITDA margins at stake. The supply shocks from this pandemic, of course, started somewhere in February 2020. However, the virus is currently a live threat. The economies like India are still under lockdowns or the shutdowns. The other regions of the world, even though they have opened, are reeling economically. And so, the disruptions in supply chains still continue. From the viewpoint of data, there is an astonishing evidence of adverse impact of pandemic on the supply chains. According to an industry report, I have put up the report from Accenture, summarizes that around 94% of Fortune 1000 companies face supply chain disruptions because of the COVID-19. Now, around 75% of companies have had negative impact because of this pandemic. An astonishing 55% of the companies plan to downgrade their growth predictions. Now, this data is not only high, but I think it is alarming. However, the worst is that most companies have reported a lack of any contingency plan to deal with a problem of this magnitude, proving that at no cost we were ready for anything like this or anything adverse. This shows that supply chains across the globe are not disruption compliant. Let us look at the Indian perspective. The logistic cost in Indian supply chains are approximately 400 million US dollars, which is about 14% of our GDP. and it is much higher in comparison to the global average of about 8%. Now, this reveals a huge competitiveness gap for India. As far as the World Bank Logistics Performance Index is concerned, we rank 44th. We are far behind US and China, with our other Asian counterparts like Thailand and Vietnam faring slightly better than us on the index. Let us come to the Indian story of COVID-19. Unlike how India entered the financial crisis of 2008, preceded by a very strong growth, we entered the pandemic with a pre-COVID slowdown. Now, to make things worse or difficult for us, the curbs imposed on the movement that affected supply chains and transportation, movements across the borders which were pretty much affected. All this leading to the shortage of raw materials. If we see the government data, it shows around that the cargo volumes at major airports fell by 57.2% in the financial year 2020-21. Now, disruptions due to the supply chain breakdowns in UK and USA has caused pressure to the supply side supply chains in India. Additionally, now this is a controversial topic. Additionally, due to the dependence on a single source for most of the raw materials and component requirements, industries like automotive and pharma are feeling the heat. Now, of course, the single source being China plus one. This in turn has increased the financial burden and longer production cycles. COVID-19 pandemic is once in a lifetime occurrence, but the supply chain bottlenecks have been exposed previously as well due to the other geo-economical phenomena like trade wars and natural disasters. However, this pandemic is just a springboard for us to rethink how to make our supply chains more resilient. So the first question arises, what to do now and what to do tomorrow when we get used to this new normal? Here are a few of the points which I have researched, and I have found that probably these could be the steps forward. So let us discuss these. Today, creating transparency all across a multi-tier supply chain will definitely help in determining the critical components used in a supply chain. This transparent data of available inventory along with the value chain should be explicitly visible to the companies to keep the production running even in case of disruptions. Integrated logistic control allows inventory and capabilities to balance demand and supply. Hence, by utilizing a clear understanding of the origin of supply, the companies can diversify the supply base and not be dependent on a single source. Well, this has been one of the very important crux or one of the very important resultant which we have understood from this pandemic. A dependence on a single supplier base has always caused a problem just in case if that particular supplier genuinely or not genuinely gets into a problem. Additionally, I think this particular aspect has been discussed a lot. Proactive communication is, of course, at the heart of the well-oiled supply chains. The companies have to ensure communication with employees, probably on-site employees, even remote employees, suppliers at different tiers, even your transport carrier, and above all, final consumer. Now, ensuring a communication with all these parties is absolutely essential. Now, knowledge of buying behavior of the customer can also contribute to an effective supply chain. Not only during these testing times, but keeping the workforce healthy and productive should be a priority of an organization. This can be achieved by adopting new ways of working which are coming up. I feel that the transparency in the supply chain will also expose many issues which have a capability of causing a financial impact to the organizations. Hence, the funds, of course, which are always a limited resource, should be managed judicially at those points in the supply chain which can cause this leakage or which can cause this adverse financial impact. These are few of the points which can actually help us rebuild the broken supply chains. Now, coming to the future course of actions, some key lessons from the pandemic can actually decide our future course of action when we go beyond the pandemic as well, when we pass through this particular phase. Firstly, building a flexible and a very responsive supply chain will take us through it all. Now, we call this agile networks where the responsiveness has to be very, very high. The bottom line of a resilient value chain probably lies in building agile networks with suppliers and carriers and any other kind of parties which are involved with the organization. Having an agile network not only gives you an edge over doing the work faster, but also makes you ready for any kind of changes which are coming through. Because when we talk about an agile network, we are not only talking about a responsive, fast responsive supply chain, we are also talking about having a very flexible systems inside that supply chains. Wherever the disruptions are, you could change those points and things like that. Secondly, digitize. I think we have been listening about this particular word and term so much that it's gone into us like our second nature. So digitization is not an option anymore. It, in fact, is a necessity, must do, and essential. It improves speed, accuracy, flexibility of a supply chain. Of course, it helps building agile networks, agility in the supply chain. Now, of course, digitization encompasses all the operations of supply chain, which includes probably manufacturing, procurement, and pretty much ignored process automation. Any kind of research done in process automation can obviously be taken to have a better, agile, flexible supply chain. We need to exploit those advances which are happening in the process automation. Apart from that, probably risk management is another important aspect which the supply chains have to look into. Incorporating risk management at all tiers of supply chain, probably the supply, helps in identifying, assessing, and mitigating the risks early on. Now, risk management is not a system, framework which has to be developed. And to develop this particular framework, it includes changing the mindsets and the cultures of organization so that we respect what exactly is risk management and we can anticipate the risks. We understand the importance of the risk management. Majorly, we have two different types of risk. One is called as known risk, one is called an unknown risk. Now, management of the known risk should be easier than the unknown risks faced by the organization supply chains. A supply chain risk framework can definitely be developed to defend against the unknown risks. But of course, as I said, this risk management has to be in the culture of the organization. The staff should know what exactly we are talking about. They should respect this particular aspect of a supply chain. The companies have to start thinking of restructuring their supply chains if required. Now, this includes rethinking at a very basic level. Rethinking if the traditional business models which you were using earlier to generate new sources of revenue should be continued, or there has to be a change in those traditional sources of generating revenues. So a restructuring, even if it means that you have to change your basic business model should be done if it's required. Coming to a very important aspect, having a responsible supply chain. Supply chains need not add to carbon footprints. Integration of sustainability criteria at every decision making point in a supply chain, I think, can add to a better and greener tomorrow. With this, I think I would say thank you. This was just a framework which I wanted to discuss, and there is a way out of pandemic. There is a way out of supply chain disruptions. Of course, this pandemic has been a learning experience for not only for the countries but majorly for supply chains, and they have realized that the supply chain is extremely important to sustaining the human life. In fact, if you do not have the same grocery ingredient probably a day or for a day or two, that's fine, but not for a long time. So to have a happier tomorrow, probably all the supply chains have to do is to become resilient and have to restructure themselves according to the changing times which we are about to see. With this, I would like to say thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you some other time. Thank you so much.